Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Springer with Schneider Downs. I'm responsible for strategy and transaction advisory services. As part of our Take 10 with Tom, we're going to talk about Tripwires to a successful transaction. I have the pleasure today to introduce you to Pete Lieberman. He's our CEO of Schneider Downs Corporate Finance. Pete, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to get started, Pete, what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about, what are the most common tripwires we see in a transaction that we've run across in sell side, buy side type deals?
So I think, I categorize the tripwires into really, kind of two categories. One is fundamental issues with the target business, with the client issues that haven't been mitigated over the lifetime of the business or the course of the transaction. So that could be anything from customer concentration that puts the business at risk if the customer goes away, a gap in the management team that makes it difficult for a third-party acquirer to come in and operate the business seamlessly. Things that put the business at risk. A lawsuit, the risk of a lawsuit, defective product or a defective project that is looming, that is, may have a financial risk or create a financial risk for a potential buyer, but that's unclear. So that's, fundamental issues with the business. And then secondary, the second one is a change over the course of the transaction process to in the environment, either specific to the business, so the business turns sideways, or broadly in the macro environment. We get some sort of an event where credit markets change, the capital markets shift, and that changes the way the buyer and the seller look at the transaction. In both of those cases, they're tripwires. They become tripwires not just because they exist, but because they create a fundamental disconnect between the buyer and seller's expectations of what the business is worth and how the business should be, how the transaction should be structured, versus reality. So it's, one, it's the condition, and then two, it contradicts some sort of expectation that's there in the seller's head.
No, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that insight. We often run across situations where the buyer and the seller are misaligned relative to what the buyer is willing to pay versus what a seller thinks his business is worth. And to close some of the gap with that misalignment, we get pretty creative, right, to prevent this tripwire in particular. Can you give a little bit of a vibe or a feel for what are some of the mechanisms or best practices we use to do that?
Sure. Well, I think first, if there is truly a fundamental difference between what buyer is willing to pay and what seller is willing to sell for, our business as advisors is to help provide owners with choices. And sometimes the answer is, let's go find someone else to buy this business because, you who is willing to pay that price or is willing to value that business in a way that's consistent with where the owner is. If that's not where we want to go, if there is there's a fundamental agreement that between buyer and seller that this is the direction they want to go, this is the owner for the business of the future, and we have kind of a disagreement over some level of risk in the business. And I think that's where a lot of times you can use structure and you can get to an agreement. If you just, two people don't think the business is worth the same thing, it's going to be tough to, unless one of them capitulates, tough to get to an agreement. If you have two people who disagree over whether a stream of revenue, whether a risk is truly a risk, whether something that could happen in the future is really going to happen, then we can use structure to allocate that risk, to allocate that risk and push the time when you got to pay for that risk out into the future some way. So you can use contingent payments and earn out, a seller note that is somehow contingent on performance, an escrow that allocates risk and sets aside money for the buyer if something bad happens. Those are pretty common tools to bridge that bid-ask spread when you've got something when the issue is not so much about fundamental value and it's really about future performance or future risk.
Yeah, again, a great insight in terms of some of those risks, in particular with the buy sell process and where people are in terms of their alignment. Also, there are, I call them sort of secondary, values that owners may have specific to a transaction. And a lot of times it's beyond just money. When they want to sell their business, what happens to that seller? Can you talk a little bit about our process and what we do to try to match a seller with the right buyer?
Sure. We think about process, and in most cases, where we work with a buyer or work with an owner, we are running a process where we talk to and we engage with multiple potential buyers at the same time. And our goal is, one, to drive the best terms for the deal. So the best price, the best legal terms, the best situation to maximize those terms based on what the owner's priorities are. And also to give that owner choices about who and what kind of an owner they want to have for their business going forward. And a lot of that comes down to chemistry and to a vision for the business that, our client base, our business is helping owner operators, a lot of, founders, entrepreneurs, family businesses who are looking for a good steward of their baby to take that business to the next level, to be the next owner of that business, and to sort of maximize what that enterprise is going to be. So you want to present to you want to have options for folks so they can see, I'm not comfortable with this particular buyer owning my company, but I'm very comfortable with this buyer's vision for the business. And maybe buyer number two's, purchase price and terms is a little bit lower, but they feel better about their employees. They feel better about themselves going to work for the business. They feel better about their legacy in the hands of someone else.
Yeah, excellent. Again, great insight. And I think by engaging professionals like Pete and his team early in a process of, in advance of a sales side transaction or even a buy side, we prevent a lot of these tripwires to a transaction. In really looking at, like, if an owner were to try to do this themselves, there's the country club multiple discussion of, hey, my buddy down the street sold my business for 3 times adjusted EBITDA. I think I already know what my business is worth, and maybe I just don't need to engage professionals. I think, with some of the insights you provided today, you can see the value of really thinking through different forms of consideration. You can think through some of the transactions relative, or the tripwires relative to the transaction, how to prevent those. And I appreciate you providing some of that insight for us. Is there any other major tripwire concern that you haven't addressed that you think is important today that we didn't cover?
I think we have our advice to owners, very broadly and very generically, it's sort of two sides of one coin. When we're talking to someone who is in the early stages of contemplating whether or not they're going to engage in a whether they're going to sell the business or they're going to try to sell the business, we tell them to do kind of two things. Tell them to, start running the business like you're going to sell it today. And really what we're focused on is telling them to start thinking about things that a buyer would think about. So what are these kind of tripwires? Where do you have legal exposure? Where do you need to build out your management team? Where do you need to enhance your customer base, or deconcentrate your customer base in a way that makes this business more saleable, more attractive to a potential buyer? So do those kind of things. At the same time, we're also telling an owner, and it's somewhat contradictory, keep running the business like you're going to own it forever. Make good long-term decisions. Invest in the business. Don't don't treat the business like something you're only going to own for another year and strip it of all the things that made it as good as it is up until now, just in order to get the last buck out of the business. That's at the end of the day, you're going to sell to someone, and you're hopefully going to sell to someone who was going to want to invest in the business going forward. They're going to want a strong, stable, dynamic business that has been invested in going forward. And you should think about that as you're approaching a sale process.
Yeah, again, great insight, Pete. Specific to that, if you don't make these decisions in terms of running your business like you always have run your business, and you start to make adjustments to increase profit or try to do certain things that are going to, you think, get higher value for you, often a buyer sees through that. And when they see through that, it actually backfires and it lowers the purchase price, creates more problems. But at the end of the day, owners are looking for future value, and future value without the owner, running and controlling all the interests of that business, so they can scale and grow that. So really appreciate that insight. To close out, this particular topic, Tripwires to a transaction, why is it important to you? Engage Pete and his team early in the process, and that will certainly help you reach a higher enterprise value level, and ultimately that leads to a higher purchase price typically. So Pete, really appreciate the insight today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you.